Something was strange. Dan looked at his neighbor's garage. The door was open and trash cans were spilling out onto the driveway. It wasn't like Kyle to leave doors open. Raccoons cause a lot of trouble in this neighborhood. He walked up to the house and noticed a newspaper on the lawn. That was a little unusual. Kyle ran every day and always stopped to pick up the newspaper. He also never left the front door open. Kyle was a theater technical designer and was constantly working with sound or lighting in his home studio. These projects often required silence or darkness, and for that reason, as well as the raccoons in the woods bordering their backyard, he had developed the habit of buttoning the house up tight unless he or Ginny went out into the yard. Dan knocked on the frame of the open door and called inside to see if anyone was home. Just as he was about to call to see if everyone was okay, he saw Kyle lying on the floor in the doorway of his studio. A small pool of blood had formed under Kyle's head. His face looked battered. His arm was bent backwards at a terrible angle and bruises were visible in all the places not covered by clothing. Kyle had been beaten in his own home and left without help. Dan quickly dialed 911 on his cell phone while he called out for Ginny. He managed to contain the adrenaline rushing through his veins long enough to give the 911 operator all the information he could, and then he rushed from room to room to make sure she wasn't lying in another room needing his help. She wasn't there. Dan had barely finished looking around the house when a police car pulled up with its lights on. An ambulance followed, and while the paramedics treated Kyle, the cops questioned Dan about what he had found. As Kyle was being taken to the emergency room, the only question on everyone's mind was, "Where is Ginny?" Fade to black. Kyle and Ginny met in college. They were both in theater programs at drama schools in New York City, in the heart of one of the most active theater communities in the world. Ginny was studying to be an actress, learning how to create the illusion of a story on stage. She was great, but for some reason she had a hard time taking directions and preferred to give them. Her teachers noticed this and took notice of how creative her ideas could be. They began to prepare her for a career as a director or theater manager. Kyle was fascinated with the behind-the-scenes magic of theater. He didn't need to create illusions as an actor. He created different realities with sound, lights, effects, and his sets. He made it easy for the audience to believe in the actor's work. Kyle was immediately recognized as a genius. He was one of those rare talents who understands all aspects of technical theater, and he was as comfortable designing lighting as he was designing a sound story. They met when they were both hired to participate in a summer project in Connecticut the summer after their freshman year. Ginny had been invited there as a stage manager for her mentor and professor, who had just been hired as director for two of the company's 4 summer productions. Kyle had worked there the previous 2 summers as an electrician, and this year became assistant director of lighting, and was given the opportunity to design one of the shows. Working closely together, the two immediately took a liking to each other. This will be the first of many productions together, both as students and as they build careers in the field. Ginny was slim and slender with a killer smile under her deep brown eyes. She was delightfully curvy in all the right places, but without a single speck of extra weight. Her long tanned legs peeked out of the shorts she always wore, and her outerwear was conservative enough to say, "Please behave yourself," yet frank enough to say, "I may have a surprise for you." Kyle was very handsome. He was an avid runner and claimed that the best ideas came to him during his morning workout when his brain was clear of the mishmash of everyday distractions. He looked like he exercised regularly, but in reality he didn't need to. The daily lifting and climbing he had to do was a perfect substitute for the strength training his friends advocated. He was fit and trim and was sure that if he continued to pursue his designs, even as a designer, he would remain so for life. For 2 weeks they shouted to each other from remote corners of the theater, focusing lights, pointing special effects speakers, and calling lines before they were finally able to sit with each other. They had to program the signals on the light board, and as they sat together, became increasingly friendly. When they were done, Ginny leaned over and kissed Kyle on the cheek, saying that she really enjoyed working with him, and that she looked forward to her work every day because of him. Kyle kissed her back, just not on the cheek. She responded, and their little tete-a-tete in the control booth got pretty hot. The door to the theater downstairs opened and slammed shut as the director walked in and called them in. "Kyle, Ginny, are you guys done yet? We need to lock up." They quickly cleaned themselves up and descended from the stall. "It's all set and you're going to love it," replied Ginny, coming down the stairs with Kyle well ahead of her, intent on hiding their little tete-a-tete. They started looking for opportunities to be together. But as filming began, time became precious. Ginny traveled with her professor every day from her apartment in town while Kyle stayed home, a short drive in the other direction. One night, Ginny's professor didn't make it to the show, but stayed in town to celebrate her daughter's birthday. Ginny was supposed to be in charge, but she had no place to stay. Kyle had offered a guest room in his house. No one else was there since his parents were spending the summer on the Cape, so there was plenty of room. Ginny was thrilled. She didn't think they would need much space. One bed would be enough. By the time they reached his house, it was late. Ginny had fallen asleep in the car, and he didn't want to distract her by taking advantage of the fact that she was so tired. After all, she had become special to him. He didn't have feelings for her like he did for those superficial girls he picked up at a college party or one of the many theater parties after a play. So when they arrived at his house, he was the perfect gentleman, the perfect host. He led her to her room, at least the one where she was supposed to sleep, and made sure she was settled in. Then he snuck into his own room to rest. He would still have time for a visit the next day. He vaguely felt the door to his room open and someone lying in bed with him. Soft, slender arms wrapped around him, and the sweetest kiss he'd ever experienced lingered on his lips. It was good. Kyle? Kyle? Get Dr. Kenton, he's waking up. Kyle! His vision flickered, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room appeared before him. It was hard to focus and he was completely confused. Only one eye was working. He tried to rise but was held up and immediately began to struggle against the restraints. Easy, easy, Kyle. You've been in rough shape, but we'll get through this. Don't fight us. We're on your side. He relaxed on the bed and looked at the post-op nurse who was talking to him. Dr. Kenton would be right there to explain everything. What's wrong with my eye? Kyle became alarmed when he realized his eye was heavily bandaged. He was badly hurt, but I must wait and let the doctor talk to you. Calm down, he'll be right with you. The doctor actually arrived very soon. He examined Kyle and talked about his injuries. Kyle was battered. His eye was bandaged as it had received at least one serious blow. The optical surgeon had repaired the detached retina, but the skull fractures around the eye socket also had to be repaired. He suffered a pretty severe concussion as a result of the blow that caused these injuries, and they were very relieved that he still had control of his speech. Kyle's arm was badly broken and was in a cast. He nearly died from a ruptured spleen and internal bleeding. If a neighbor had found him an hour later, he would not have survived. His nose and several ribs were broken. He had been unconscious for 2 days since he was found, and they were still trying to determine the time of the attack to figure out how long he had been lying unattended. I don't remember the attack. The doctor frowned and started asking Kyle questions. When he realized that Kyle couldn't remember any of the circumstances surrounding the weekend or the Friday before, he started asking general questions. As he finished, Dr. Kenton realized that Kyle couldn't remember anything that had happened since freshman year. Before his encounter with Ginny, Kyle had suffered severe memory loss as a result of the attack, and only time would tell how soon she would return. Detective Porter, who had been assigned to investigate Kyle's case, was visibly disturbed. His chronology of the incidents leading up to the attack had hit a dead end last Friday, when Kyle had disabled the home security system. Where had Ginny been all this time? Shade of black. Senior year passed like a blur. Kyle saw Ginny regularly, and their love grew every day. By the end of the year, both had established careers, with Kyle working regularly as a designer for several small suburban houses, and often backstage at theaters downtown for well-known designers. Ginny got a backstage job with a major opera company at Lincoln Center, a stable job with great benefits that she could keep for life. They rented a small apartment around the corner from her theater, and enjoyed the bustling performing arts scene in the city. He remembered the tender moments they had spent together. She had decorated and shopped tastefully, and their apartment had been furnished so lavishly that it had become a popular hangout for their friends. He was a gourmet cook. Whether he cooked dinner for himself and company, or just a candlelit dinner for the two of them, she always rolled her eyes in delight at his delicious cooking. Her eyes were rolling in bed, too. Kyle woke up in a cold sweat, still lying in the hospital bed. Ginny. How Ginny fit into his life now. He had been told about the amnesia and how slowly it could come back. He had been told that these attacks would happen every once in a while, and he would almost relive his life as the oldest lost memories came back first. He wasn't prepared for how vivid the dreams would be, and how much the thoughts of lovemaking would bother him. Previously, Kyle could only think of Ginny as a girl he knew from summer company, but now the memories of living with her came back to him. He really wanted to remember how she had fit into his life in the years that the concussion had taken from him. Where was Ginny now? Memories of their early life permeated his mind during the days that followed. Her advancement in her career eventually led to a position as stage manager at a very active suburban theater that put on plays and concerts. This company liked Kyle's work and often utilized his services. The couple succeeded financially and decided to get married. Now he could remember the wedding. The ceremony in the little church flashed before his eyes in minute detail. He could hear the small organ playing Bach, smell the distinct scent of beeswax candles burning at the altar, and his eyes watered at the sight of the smiling bride walking toward him. He could taste the delicious food in the little Greek restaurant where they had their wedding feast. They danced and then hugged family and friends as they traveled to the small inn where they were to spend their wedding night. Everything was beautiful. In the room, a fire burned in the brick hearth located right at the foot of their bed. They stood by the flickering flames and kissed. They swayed to music that wasn't there. With tenderness, he undid the buttons on her satin dress. As elegant as she looked in it, the glow of the fire further emphasized her nakedness. His body was beautiful, and she slowly approached Kyle, enclosing him in an embrace. He responded to her passionate kisses and pulled her down onto the bed. That night they made love slowly, each taking time to get to know every inch of the other's body. They kissed every inch of each other, and when they finished making love, they stared at each other's faces for hours, dreaming of a long life together in old age. In the morning they woke up the same way they had fallen asleep, face to face, looking at each other. Kyle woke up again in his hospital bed in a cold sweat. He still couldn't stay awake for long, but he always woke up feeling upset when his dreams included sex with Ginny. Why did he always wake up this way? Was he still married to Ginny? If so, where was she? He asked the nurse to tell him what they knew about him. I can't do that, she replied. I don't know enough about you to fill in the blanks. I can help you remember, but if I suggest something wrong, it could lead to more serious problems. Unfortunately, your concussion and eye condition require that you remain calm and quiet. Stress is undesirable right now, my friend. Dr. Kenton stopped by during his evening rounds. He was pleased to see that Kyle remembered events all the way back to his wedding, but there was still a 15-year gap between them. He agreed to give Kyle some information, but on the condition that Kyle would take it calmly. You're still married to Ginny, according to the neighbor who found you and saved your life. You still work as a freelance theater designer, and you're doing quite well. You have a beautiful home near this hospital. You and your wife have no children, but otherwise you are the stereotypical happy couple living the American dream. Now that Kyle looked more alert and sane, the doc spoke once again about the seriousness of Kyle's injuries. They were sure he would make a full recovery from everything. He went into detail about each injury, and Kyle heard nothing but blah blah blah. He didn't hear the answer to the question he wanted to ask, but could only think, where is Ginny? Ginny lay down on the dock by the lake. The water was cool on the fingers of her hand over the edge. Clouds hung overhead, slowly rolling over the hills that rose steeply on either side of the lake. She was in another world, far away from the city's rat race, from the constant demands of the snotty prima donna actors and musicians who came to perform on her stage. She was also far away from Kyle. She didn't know what to think of that realization. She was sure she still loved Kyle, but he was such a workaholic. He could never find time to relax, and his schedule was so tight that she just didn't feel that their time together was a priority. This little vacation with Steve was just what she needed. What could Kyle do to her? Divorce her? Fine. She looked over at Steve. He was standing on the beach, his back turned to her, kneading dumbbells in the sun, finishing his morning workout. Muscles bulged up and down his back, huge arms glistening with sweat. Steve had been a star college soccer player and had played several seasons in the NFL before injuring his knee. Now Steve ran a local chain of fitness clubs and kept his body so trim. He was smart about money and hired a manager who invested his NFL earnings in real estate. Who cared that he was dumb about everything but money? He couldn't sustain a conversation about anything but soccer and bodybuilding. But when he enclosed her in his arms, it was like something out of a dime novel. She fainted when he picked her up and carried her to the bed. Okay, Kyle, she pondered, get a divorce. We don't have kids, and look what I'll get. I'll be married to Mr. Universe. And I'll be Mrs. Universe. I'll trade the dusty theater for a gym where I can work out whenever I want. Or spend all day admiring bodybuilders in liquor tights if I want. She couldn't wait for him to call. After Kyle had confronted them at the house when they'd left last Friday, she'd half expected to be wanted here by the bailiff with the divorce papers. She picked up her phone for the 100th time today to make sure it was working and ready for his call. The battery was charged. The signal was full, thanks to the convenient tower she'd spotted at the top of the hill. The ringer was on loud, but there were no calls from Kyle. They hadn't called her from work, as she'd arranged this week of vacation months ago. Kyle hadn't called in a week after begging her not to go with Steve. How could you beg someone for attention 1 minute and then not call for a whole week? And now it was Friday, and she hadn't heard from Kyle. She sat on the dock. Her naked body glistened from a week's worth of sunbathing all day, and from visiting various wineries and taverns each evening. She loved the Finger Lakes. The evening sun illuminated everything around them so beautifully. Why did Kyle always insist on vacationing at the cottage on the Cape? No crowds, no small beaches, just the quiet solitude of the woods. Kyle again. She couldn't get rid of thoughts of him. Why hadn't he called? It was so strange. She sat down and dialed her home number. The message service answered. It wasn't pleasant to hear a recording of her own voice in response. She'd left a message in Kyle's box saying she'd be home early Sunday morning and they could talk then. When she hung up, she sat pensive, not letting go of the phone. Maybe there wouldn't be a divorce. Maybe Kyle would roll over on his back and beg her to come home. Yes, he will be on his best behavior from now on, cooking clean and keeping her in a manner befitting a goddess. Oh yes, silly Kyle will fulfill her every whim while she runs around and enjoys the awesome body of her stud Steve. Kyle should be home.